I can't think of an intro for this one. We're talking about that Bill Maher segment. Just roll the footage.
And finally, new rule: if something about the human race is changing at a previously unprecedented rate,
as opposed to a rate that is currently unprecedented but has been precedented previously. What?
we have to at least discuss it. Broken down over time, the LGBT population of America seems to be roughly doubling every generation.
Wait, I thought you said it was previously unprecedented, whatever that means. Now you're saying that actually it's been consistently doubling for multiple generations? Well, if so, then it doubling this generation seems pretty damn precedented.
According to a recent Gallup poll, less than 1% of Americans born before 1946, that's Joe Biden's generation, identify that way. 2.6% of boomers do, 4.2% of Gen X, 10.5% of millennials, and 20.8% of Gen Z. Which means if we follow this trajectory, we will all be gay in 2054.
Or bisexual, or transgender, or some other identity that is not specifically heterosexual and cisgender.
I'm just saying that when things change this much, this fast, people are allowed to ask, what's up with that?
I see somebody is just asking questions.
All the babies are in the wrong bodies? Was there a mix-up at the plant, like with Captain Crunch's Oops, All Berries?
You do know that most of these new LGBT people, as you're putting it, aren't transgender, right? In fact, actually looking at the Gallup poll that you mentioned earlier, Bill, you can find that the most common identification is bisexual. In fact, of the 20.8% of LGBT people among Gen Z that you mentioned earlier, that's what roughly 3/4 of them identify as.
In the wake of America about to lose abortion rights, the ACLU recently tweeted a list of those who would be disproportionately harmed by this. You would think women might top that list? No, wasn't even on the list.
Okay, for those who don't know, he's talking about this tweet where the ACLU lists groups, many of whom you wouldn't really expect, that are disproportionately harmed by bans on abortion. The reason why cisgender women weren't specifically included is because everybody who opposes abortion bans, and even quite a few people who support them, already realized that abortion bans would harm women more than men. What the ACLU is essentially saying is that not only would it harm women more than men, but it would harm these subsects even more than it would harm the average woman. Somebody who's pro-choice but needs to be reminded constantly that abortion bans harms women more than men is not some disenfranchised liberal who's just asking questions. They sound more like a dementia patient.
The answer can't always be that anyone from a marginalized community is automatically right, trump card, mic drop, end of discussion. Because we're literally experimenting on children. Maybe that's why Sweden and Finland have stopped giving puberty blockers to kids.
I just want to point out that Sweden is one of the countries that forced transgender people to, if they wanted to change the sex they were legally recognized as, undergo procedures that essentially amounted to forced sterilization. This was the law from the 1970s until early 2013, and the Swedish government has had to pay several people a lot of money as a result. Oh, also, Sweden as a whole didn't stop the practice of giving puberty blockers to children. It was one hospital in Sweden. And for those curious, there are 100 hospitals in Sweden. As for the story out of Finland, Bill also got that wrong. What actually happened is that the Finnish medical guidelines changed to say that puberty blockers can be given, but should only be used in extreme circumstances, and even then, it needs to be further researched. To quote the medical guidelines as quoted in the article, based on thorough case-by-case consideration, the initiation of hormonal interventions that alter sex characteristics may be considered before the person is 18 years of age, only if it can be ascertained that their identity as the other sex is of a permanent nature and causes severe dysphoria. In addition, it must be confirmed that the young person is able to understand the significance of irreversible treatments and the benefits and disadvantages associated with lifelong hormone therapy, and that no contradictions are present. Yeah, you should only use puberty blockers in case of extreme gender dysphoria to propagate a permanent identity. That makes perfect sense to me and to basically any transgender person I've talked to. I wouldn't even be bothered by this so much if it weren't for Bill's use of the word stopped. Well, neither of these countries stopped. One country had one hospital that stopped, and the other country implemented stricter guidelines for who they are allowed to use it on. For the record, I myself have mixed feelings on the idea of puberty blockers for children. Personally, I don't like the idea of children that young undergoing any kind of medication. However, I do recognize that it does make sense if we accept the notion that children should take medication, even ones that could be potentially life-altering, if we have good evidence that if they don't take it, what they have will fester into a lifelong problem. Still, I at the very least understand that reasonable minds can differ on this topic. My issue is not that Bill is against puberty blockers for children. My issue is that Bill gets things factually incorrect.
Because we just don't know much about the long-term effects.
I mean, the FDA approved them in 1993, so you'd think we'd know something about the long-term effects, considering we've been using them for almost 30 years at this point.
Although common sense should tell you that when you reverse the course of raging hormones, there's going to be problems. We do know it hinders the development of bone density, which is kind of important if you like having a skeleton. Fertility and the ability to have an orgasm seem also to be affected.
So we don't know about the long-term effects, Bill says, before he goes on to say some of the long-term effects. As for the claim about bone density, I should begin by noting that The Times is not a good source for trans-related issues. It's a well-known transphobic news source, as is most of the media in the UK, if I'm being honest with you. However, I did still read the article, and I found this part to be rather interesting, personally. Researchers said the overall response in the study was mostly positive, with many reporting feeling happier. Others reported negative changes related to side effects such as headaches, flushes, and fatigue. The study had no control group, meaning its findings on the possible harms or benefits remain inconclusive. So no, Bill, we don't know that bone density is impacted. The article specifically calls this research inconclusive, meaning we haven't reached a conclusion on it, or, to put it another way, we don't know anything from it. The claim about infertility comes from a Washington Post article called "An Idaho Bill Would Criminalize Medical Treatment for Trans Use." It echoes abortion bans. Here is the full paragraph from that article. Hormone blockers do not cause infertility, according to experts. For transgender teenagers who first take puberty blockers and then take estrogen and testosterone treatments, the Endocrine Society warns that the treatment may compromise fertility later in life. But experts say more research is needed on the subject. Lastly, what I am going to lovingly call the transgender orgasm claim comes from a 2022 article from the well-known beacon of journalism, the New York Post, with the headline, "Anguished parents of trans kids fight back against gender cult trying to silence them." Here is the quote in context, and to be fair, Bill didn't necessarily take this one out of context, but he definitely downplays the uncertainty in this quote as he does in all the other ones. Dr. Marcy Bowers, the transgender woman who was Jazz Jennings' surgeon, admitted during a recent Duke University Zoom call with Dr. Joanne Olson Kennedy, one of the premier transgender specialists in the country, and others that young boys given puberty blockers and hormones probably have never experienced orgasm and likely never will once their testosterone is shut off. I should also note that the link between testosterone and the ability to easily orgasm is incredibly well documented. It's one of the reasons why men generally have an easier time orgasming than women do. But even then, the fact remains that Bill was just wrong. He says that all three of these things are what we know, when, truth be told, we don't. We don't have the information needed to say that we know these. Every article Bill cites directly says that.
This isn't just a lifestyle decision, it's medical. Weighing trade-offs is not bigotry. Yet when a book questioning the sudden uptick in transitioning children was released, a trans lawyer with the ACLU named Chase Strangio tweeted, "Stopping the circulation of this book and these ideas is 100% a hill I will die on."
Yeah, coming from someone who's actually read Irreversible Damage and wrote a review of it, I just want to say that the book is utterly nonsensical. And it does not question an uptick like Bill said. If anything, it's conspiratorially fear-mongering while claiming to have found the answer to this uptick. That apparently transgender people are convincing other people to be transgender through getting them to not have sex. Seriously, that's one of the claims in the book. I'm not saying the book should be censored or anything. You have the right to read it in the same way you have the right to read on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I also have an article comparing that book to that very infamous anti-Semitic propaganda piece, if any of you are curious. However, calling it anything but a conspiratorial hit piece barely better than the reporting you'd find about the Weston Pravda is very misleading. As for the Strangulo tweet, he later clarified to Glenn Greenwald that he was primarily talking about stopping legislation based off of the book, as opposed to censoring the book itself, and he wanted to do that through putting out counter-information that debunks the claims presented in it. To build off of a comparison I made earlier, I do believe people have the right to read on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion if they so choose. However, I have the right to call it an anti-Semitic forgery that was primarily plagiarized out of satires, because it was. For that matter, if somebody in government reads that book and attempts to implement anti-Semitic policies because of it, I still have a right to criticize them. Believing people have the right to spread whatever ideas they wish does not mean that I have to believe there are no bad ideas and no one should criticize anything. That's just simply not how the world works.
And this is a phenomenon we need to take into account when we look at this issue. Yes, part of the rise in LGBT numbers is from people feeling free enough to tell it to a pollster, and that's all to the good. But some of it is, it's trendy. Penis equals man? Okay, boomer. Remember, the prime directive of every teen is anything to shock and challenge the squares who brought you up. It's why nobody gets a nose ring at 56.
Well, wait a minute, if this is all just one big attempt at rebellion, then why did it only occur when LGBT identities started becoming more acceptable? Wouldn't it have been the opposite effect? Wouldn't it have been occurring when it was unacceptable? Because that's what rebellion is, doing things that are seen as unacceptable specifically to state your disagreement with it. And it's not as if people haven't used LGBT identities as a form of rebellion before. Just look at what political lesbianism was in the 70s if you want evidence of that. However, again, that was at a time when lesbianism was widely unaccepted. So again, if the point is rebellion, why is it occurring now?
If you attend a small dinner party of typically very liberal upper-income Angelenos, it is not uncommon to hear parents who each have a trans kid having a conversation about that. What are the odds of that happening in Youngstown, Ohio? If this spike in trans children is all natural, why is it regional? Either Ohio is shaming them or California is creating them.
According to the website LGBTmap.org, 4.3% of adults in Ohio identify as LGBT. That same website lists the LGBT population in California at 5.3%. But you know what? Bill's talking about transgender children specifically, and a 1% difference is still a difference, so we'll consider this point a little bit more than I probably should. In which case, the first thing I feel the need to note is the fact that we just do not have evidence that you can create a transgender identity. Remember, trying to convince a cisgender person that they are transgender is what John Money attempted to do with David Reimer, and it didn't work. And Reimer was specifically lied to and raised as a girl after undergoing a sex change operation before he was old enough to remember it occurred, in hopes he would never know of his assigned male at birth status. And despite that, it didn't work. To give a more recent example, a commentator named Avi Holtman was groomed with the end goal of making him think he was transgender. And it didn't work because, again, you cannot construct a transgender identity in somebody who is organically cisgender. We just do not have evidence that you can do that. Meanwhile, a 2020 USA Today article that ranks each state by LGBT acceptance ranks Ohio at 36th. So yes, Ohio shaming them is far more likely than California creating them. The rest of Bill's monologue is entirely based off of this notion that you can make somebody transgender, which, considering I just debunked, means that if I were to continue commentating on the video, it would just be me repeating that same point over and over again. So I'm ending it here. Final thoughts? I got 10,000 views recently, and I'd just like to thank everyone who helped me get there. I understand that's not a lot, especially compared to the person who I'm commentating on who has a show on HBO, but that's still more than I would have gotten had I never made any of these videos, and honestly, I'm happy about that. It's evidence the ideas are at the very least getting out there, even if only to a handful of people. Good night, and good luck.